I am very glad to be here with you, and first of all with Professor Quentin Skinner, famous professor from Great Britain, and our, as I hope, friend. Professor Skinner is an eminent scholar, formerly professor of political science and Regius Professor of history at Cambridge University. Currently Barbara Beaumont, Professor of the Humanities at Queen Mary University College London. Professor Skinner centers his research on early modern Europe, and one of his principal interests lies in the Italian Renaissance. He has published books on Machiavelli, on early Renaissance political thinking, on the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, on ideals of civic virtue, and his best-known work, The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, attempts to span the whole early modern period. Professor Skinner has also written extensively on the relations between rhetoric and philosophy, and has just completed a book on Shakespeare and forensic eloquence. His philosophical interests include speech act theory, the nature of interpretation, and historical explanation. Professor Skinner is also known as a founder of the Cambridge School of the History of Political Thought that centered its attention to the languages of political thought and the contextual focus. Professor is has honorary degrees. University of Copenhagen, Oslo, Santiago, Aberdeen, Athens, St. Andrews, Harvard, Catholic University, Leuven, Oxford, Helsinki, and Chicago too. So I am very glad to see Professor Quentin Skinner here in the oldest Polish university, and at the guest of the, first of all, our BA program in English, International Relations and Area Studies, in the second position of the Chair of Political Philosophy inside our Institute of International Relations and Political Science, and third, as a guest of our Faculty of International Political Studies. First part of our meeting will be delivered Professor Quentin Skinner. Second will be discussion. Professor Dorota Pietrzyk-Reeves, which is head of our BA program, International Relations and Area Studies, which will deliver this part. Professor, microphone is yours. Please.
Before I say anything else, may I say a word of very heartfelt thanks to you all for allowing me to come here and speak to you in my own language. This is an extraordinary privilege, and it's one that English speakers must above all not take for granted. So, dziękuję. It's also a very great honor, as well as a great pleasure, to be invited here and to speak in one of these many absolutely spectacular spaces that you have in this great university. Thank you all very much. Well, I'm going to talk about a genealogy of liberty. If I were you sitting right at the back, I would come further forward, because this is going to be quite a test on your eyesight otherwise. So if anyone feels it would be, yes, good. I'm sure that's a good idea. Can you see that from the back? There's going to be a great deal of writing. Yeah, good idea. Yeah, keep going. Well, to speak of freedom or liberty, and I shall use those two words interchangeably, is to speak of one of our core political values, no question of that. So it would be good if I could write or talk in such a way as to work towards a definition of the term that expresses this concept, on which we might at least in principle agree. I come before you as a kind of Nietzschean scholar, inasmuch as I think that one of the most profound observations that Nietzsche makes in the great Genealogy of Morality is that concepts which have histories cannot have definitions. Of course, some concepts have definitions, but no concept that has a history can have a definition. I really think that is true, and it's an extremely important guiding principle for me. What does it mean as a guiding principle? It means genealogy. If there's no possibility of giving a conceptual analysis that we could agree on, then all that we can hope to do is to trace the evolution, the contestation, the dialogue that takes place over concepts which, like freedom, have always been in dispute. So it's that series of disputes about how to think about freedom that I'm going to try to talk to you about. Well, obviously that's an enormous topic, and I can't possibly manage it in less than an hour. So I've got to impose something quite arbitrary in the way of a constraint on what I'm going to talk about. My arbitrary constraint is this: I shall talk just about the English language tradition. Now, that is not because I think it's the most important, but it is the one that I know about, and many years of giving lectures has persuaded me that one should stick to what one knows about. However, if that seems very parochial, I want to suggest that, as it happens, it's not. The Anglophone tradition of thinking about freedom in the modern world has turned out to be of rather particular importance. So that is what I shall talk about. Now, if we focus on the Anglophone tradition, we find that the earliest systematic treatise in which the concept of civil liberty, the individual liberty of persons as subjects of states, was first systematically analyzed in what is, as it happens, probably the most important work of political philosophy ever written in the English language, namely Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, first published in 1651. Chapter 21 of Hobbes's Leviathan is entitled The Liberty of Subjects. And that really inaugurates the modern discussion of political liberty in English language political philosophy. So that's why I want to begin with Hobbes. Now, a further merit of beginning with Hobbes is that his understanding of how to think about political liberty turned out to be extraordinarily influential, as a result of which his analysis is a very familiar one. And you'll see that as soon as we move to the first slide. I've called this the liberal... Can you see all right? If not, well, we're getting full up, but there's still space here if you want to come forward. You're all right. Okay. I've called this the liberal concept, and as you see, it's a very simple one. It just has two components. The proposal is that for an individual to enjoy freedom, a citizen of a state, there must be power on the part of the individual to act in pursuit of some given option. Doesn't have to be an option, according to Hobbes. It could just be either or. It could just be an alternative. As long as there's an alternative, there is freedom. And secondly, there must be no interference with the exercise of that power by external agencies. I've said agencies, not agents, because these are not just individual human agents. Hobbes thinks that your freedom can be interfered with by other people, by corporations, by states, by natural forces. So we need to keep the idea of agency extremely wide. But there is the understanding. So let's take the two ideas in turn. First, power. Hobbes insists, this is valuable, I think, that it makes no sense to talk about freedom in the absence of having a power. So Hobbes wants to say that if you lack the power to act in a certain way, so for example, if you lack the power to walk on water, shall we say, then according to Hobbes, of course you're not free to walk on water, but you're also not unfree to walk on water. The question of freedom does not arise Why not? Because you just lack the power. What you lack is not freedom, it's ability. So you can put that same point the other way round and thereby bring out its significance by saying that if you are unfree, that must be because some agency has disempowered you. So freedom is connected with disempowerment. That's the fundamental connection. Unfreedom is having been disempowered. Secondly, the idea of interference. This is just Hobbes's view about how to understand his core idea of being disempowered. What disempowers you? Interference disempowers you. So on this analysis, freedom is simply absence of interference. Very simple idea. But obviously that's too simple. That doesn't get us very far, because if freedom is absence of interference, it turns out that what you really need to understand is this completely unanalyzed idea of interference. What is interference? What does that mean? Well, Hobbes has, of course, thought of that. And here is Hobbes's understanding of interference. External agencies are said to interfere with freedom when they act on a body in such a way that an action counterfactually within the power of that person is either prevented or compelled. Notice you can always lose your freedom in one of two ways, either by being forced into doing something or stopped from doing something. So, is either prevented or compelled. That's always going to be true in any talk about freedom, but in such a way that physical force has been applied to make an action impossible. So that's the Hobbesian analysis of interference. Okay, that's Hobbes's account. So let's look at it for a moment. Now, as you contemplate that, one implication, very important but also very counterintuitive implication, will at once occur to you. It's said to be only bodily interference that takes away freedom. The implication is that if it is only your will that has been interfered with, so for example, if you only obey the law because you're frightened of the consequences of not obeying it, so that the law coerces your will, if that's your condition, then your freedom is unaffected. The law does not affect you usually by physically acting on you. It affects you by coercively acting on your will. And Hobbes's claim is that does not affect freedom. As he summarizes in Leviathan, fear and liberty are consistent. Now, Hobbes really means that, and he takes an example which is common in early modern philosophy, which is the figure of the highwayman. The highwayman is the person who points a gun at you and says, your money or your life. Now, Hobbes's point is this: when you decide to hand over your money, don't forget that you were offered a choice. The highwayman said, your money or your life. There's an alternative. If there's an alternative, there's a choice. If there's a choice, there's freedom. Now, Hobbes has an unpleasant joke at this moment. He says that when you hand over your money, you not only do it willingly, and therefore freely, but very willingly. So don't say it wasn't a free action. Now, that's crucial to Hobbes. Coercion of the will does not take away freedom of action. Okay, there is the Hobbesian analysis. And I just want to add, because this is a genealogy and we're going to see how the story comes down into our own times in every case, this view of how to think about freedom is still very prominent in Anglophone political philosophy. In fact, two of the most ambitious treatises on the theory of individual political liberty of the last years, Ian Carter's book, A Measure for Freedom, and Matthew Kramer's major treatise called The Quality of Freedom, Oxford Press, 2003, they both want you to understand freedom essentially in this Hobbesian way. So the genealogy runs down into the 21st century. There are Hobbesians. However, if we look at this, and we now continue the genealogy from 1651, from Leviathan, what you will find historically is that in the next generation, this view was vigorously attacked. And the most celebrated work of Anglophone political philosophy which attacks this view is the next most important work of early modern English philosophy of politics, namely John Locke's Treatises on Government, first published in 1689. Now, Locke agrees, of course, that you're unfree to act if you can't bodily exercise a power. I don't think anyone really disagrees with that. I mean, if it turns out that these doors are locked, then you are unfree to leave this room, even if you wish to, because you're physically prevented. But what Locke wants to say is that you are also prevented from acting if your will is coerced. So he wants to overturn that aspect of Hobbes' analysis. I quote, this is paragraph 176 of Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Should a robber break into my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, does that give him any legal title? Notice it's just a rhetorical question. Locke thinks the answer is obviously not. And why not? Well, because although your action, the dagger is at your throat, so of course you sign, is not impossible for you to refuse, but it is, as John Locke says, so unappealing that you'd never choose that. And if there's only an alternative, and there's one that you would just never choose, then when you choose, it's not fully free. It's not entirely free. Coercion of the will does undermine freedom. So we need to add Locke's argument. Now you begin to see the genealogy. I've put Thomas Hobbes right down on the left wing there. He doesn't want to be there, but you now see Hobbes running down the left-hand side. And here is the thought most philosophers have wished to add, and it's the founding thought of classical liberalism, is you must add or bending the will, which is Locke's phrase, by coercion. That is one way of bending your will. However, notice that we're now dealing with a concept that makes no appearance in Hobbes' analysis, coercion. What does that mean? There's a new, unanalyzed concept. Notice how clever Hobbes is in his account. He doesn't have to think about coercion. He's made this completely physicalist. But once you agree with the classical liberal view that coercion of the will limits freedom of action, then the concept you need to understand in order to understand freedom is coercion, because that's the positive concept. Now, that being so, it's rather remarkable that Locke never offers an analysis of coercion in the treatises on government. All he does is to offer what he thinks are obvious examples. I quote paragraph 222, threats, promises, offers, bribes. These are all means of bending the will. So you get the picture, but it's not satisfactory, is it, once you think about it? It shows we need an analysis, which Locke doesn't give. I mean, one thing that's obviously unsatisfactory is the inclusion of bribes. Is it really true that if I offer you a bribe, then I coerce you? I mean, suppose a corrupt politician in a court of law says to the judge, I'm innocent because the bribe was so enormous that I had no alternative but to accept it. That is not a plea. So something's gone wrong with Locke's examples. We need an analysis. We need to understand coercion. What counts as bending the will in such a way as to limit freedom? Now, as I say, Locke doesn't provide an account, and as far as I can see, the earliest Anglophone legal political philosopher who does so is, it doesn't happen until the classic analysis is given by Jeremy Bentham in his great treatise of the 1780s called Of the Limits of the Penal Branch of Legislation. So notice the genealogy is moving now from the 17th into the 18th century. Here's Bentham's suggestion. To understand coercion, you have to see that there are basically two ways in which you can bend someone's will. You can promise them a reward for complying with your will. So if they accept, they're better off. If they refuse, they're no worse off. So, for example, I could say, if you do what I ask, I'll give you €1,000,000. Or, instead of promising a reward, you could threaten a penalty for non-compliance with my will. So I would say, if you don't do what I ask, I'll kill you. So that you either comply, in which case you're no better off, or you don't comply, in which case you're worse off. In this case, much worse off, you're dead. Now, Bentham's proposal is that we should call the first of those allurement, and only the second is coercion. What coercion is examples of the second kind, where you're no better off and could be worse off. And the reason that Bentham wants that to be coercion is his point is this. He uses a nice word. He says, these choices are ineligible. You would not freely choose these choices because they are based on a threat and they include avoiding a penalty. Now, there's been a lot of contemporary interest in this analysis in current political philosophy, and the classic work was done by Robert Nozick. He has a famous essay called Coercion. He shows that this doesn't quite work, this Bentham analysis, because there could be promises of benefits that are nevertheless coercive. But that's a complexity. Another complexity philosophers have looked at is the relation between threats and offers. We could talk about that in discussion if you like, but nobody has attacked Bentham's fundamental claim that the paradigm case of coercion is issuing a threat. A promise might have the form of a threat, but fundamentally coercion is about threats. It's only the case that that is so if the threat itself has certain qualities attached to it. The threat, this is Bentham, the threat must be credible. If it's not credible, it won't affect your will, obviously. It must be immediate, you don't think you can escape, and it must be serious, you think it really matters. But if there's a threat which is credible, immediate, and serious, and there's a coercive penalty attached to non-performance, then you will perform, but not freely. That's coercion. So we can incorporate this refinement. So there's Bentham's analysis of ineligibility by threats that are credible, immediate, and serious. Now, is this the analysis of individual liberty that you want? I mean, if it is, this is a very short lecture. Now, within the Anglophone liberal tradition, it was widely agreed for a long time that that's it. That is the account you want to give. And that view has also come down to our own time. So, sorry, I need this. Just as you find Hobbes over on the left there, you find Locke and Bentham over on the right here, but just as Hobbes comes down into the 21st century with people like Carter and Kramer, so this story comes down into the 20th century with the most famous Anglophone contribution in the 20th century to exactly my topic this morning, namely Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Isaiah Berlin, in that famous essay, has a preferred concept. What is his preferred concept? You're looking at it. That's it. It's as it were Hobbes plus Locke, or Hobbes plus Bentham. So that rival genealogical tree comes down to our time. However, within the Anglophone liberal tradition, there arose a further complicating moment only a generation after Bentham, and my genealogy now moves from the 18th century into the first half of the 19th century, and we come to the most famous Anglophone contribution to my topic, namely John Stuart Mill's essay called On Liberty, published in 1859. One of the moves that Mill makes in that famous essay is to point out that the liberal tradition so far, what you're looking at, embodies one principle that he thinks questionable. And you see it at the top of the chart in the middle. That the interference has to be by external agencies. Nobody has doubted that. The interference has to be by external agencies. That's to say another person, a group, a corporation, the state, some other external agency. But what Mill asks in chapter 3 of the essay is it true that freedom is always interpersonal in that way? So you and the state, or you and a corporation, or you and another person. Is it always interpersonal in that way? Or could it be that the person who undermines your freedom could somehow be you? Now, as soon as you entertain that thought, the liberal tradition becomes much more complicated. And this complication is what is investigated in much political philosophy in the second half of the 19th century, as the attempt is made to make sense of this radical extension of the notion of interference. So here is how the chart looks post-Mill. So a big conceptual divide has opened up. The whole of the classical liberal tradition is now over on the left and coming down. Can you still see at the back? You can come to the front if you can't. The whole of the classical liberal tradition is now along the left, but we have this alternative by external agencies or the self-preventing or compelling action due to the operation of, well, what? There's now the question. How can the self undermine the freedom of the self? Can we make sense of that? Well, we enter deep philosophical waters at this point, but in the late 19th century discussion of this, I think it would be fair to say that 3 possibilities were discussed. And here is the first. The impact of an overpowering emotion. Now, this thought is certainly present in Mill, but it's an ancient thought, and it's embodied in a metaphor which I think is certainly in all the Romance languages, which is being a slave to passion. Notice vocabulary of slavery, you're unfree. Now, that idea is very important in the so-called rationalist phase of early modern philosophy. And you find it, for example, classically stated in the Anglophone tradition. The statement would be John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. He doesn't go into this in the Politics, but he does in his epistemology. And here's the idea. You must think of the will as capable of allying itself either with reason. If the will allies itself with reason, the resulting action is a free action. But the will can ally itself with passion. That's to say, it can be governed by some very strong passion, rage or hatred or envy or all the deadly sins. And if that leads to action, the action is not an act of liberty, it's an act of license. And so you get this profound distinction in 17th century philosophy, which of course Hobbes refuses and Hume later refuses, but there it is, between liberty and license. So if the act is grounded on passion instead of reason, it's not free. So notice a conceptual link is made between freedom and reason, which of course is picked up by Kant and then becomes very important in the whole Kantian tradition. But I don't think that that is the main source of Mill's insight. Rather, he is moved by a different thought. I quote the very beginning of the essay on liberty. In our time, he's talking of mid-19th century England, the yoke of law has become lighter, but the yoke of opinion has become heavier. Now, that's a profound remark because it's true that originally the classical tradition saw the opposition between the subject and the state, or the subject and the sovereign. But Mill wants to say we've got the entry of a quite different force in modern society. There's the citizen, there's the state, but between them there's civil society. Now Hobbes never talks about civil society, of course not. There's just you and the state, and that's a very common early modern assumption. But here is this entry of the idea that civil society not only interposes itself, the realm of Sittlichkeit, as Hegel was saying at the same time, slightly earlier, but here's the point. Civil society can be a source of inauthenticity. How? Because the norms of civil society, its codes, its expectations, its customary actions, can have such an effect on you. It's not a legal effect. The law is not involved. The state keeps out of all of this. But you may feel there are certain ways in which you just can't not behave. So there's the thought. You inauthentically internalize these mores. It's quite clear that Mill is thinking here of Tocqueville and the whole discussion of société civile as interposing between state and person. I quote Mill. This is chapter 3 of the essay on liberty. The people of England think themselves free, but they choose what is customary in preference to their inclination, until it does not occur to them to have any inclination except for what is customary. And then the mind itself is bound to the yoke. Notice again the language of slavery. You're a slave to the passions, or you're a slave to convention. You dare not violate it. Now, I want to round off this part of my discussion by adding, as I mentioned, a third possibility, although this will for a moment cause me to skid slightly off my purely Anglophone track. But we can't fail to notice this. Mill comes very near to this with his discussion of what he calls the permanent interests of man as a progressive being. But of course, the classic expression of the idea that you could act so much against your interests that we would have to say that your consciousness of what is in your interests is a false consciousness is, of course, most associated with the philosophy of Marx and the thesis on Feuerbach, and especially in modern times, which is why I'm not really off my Anglophone track, the translations of the Frankfurt School, especially the work of Marcuse and the early Habermas, into all our languages, of course, but certainly into the English language, made this extremely important from the mid-20th century onwards. The Frankfurter suggestion, based on Marx's claim in the thesis on Feuerbach that social being determines consciousness, is that if your consciousness is determined by a society in which your choices are, roughly speaking, presented in consumerist terms, then you will be liable to be the agent of your own unfreedom by endorsing a consumerist and hence, on this account, a false account of what is in your interests. Now, I want to add, those are my three, but here's the most important. Other possibilities? It's worth thinking about them. I mean, one obvious possibility that will have occurred to all of you is Freud's theory, which he always presented as a theory of liberation. It's not a political theory, but there is the case in which the self is seen as undermining the conditions of freedom of the self. because the unconscious contains motives. You're not aware of them, so they generate neurotic and obsessional behavior, but you can be freed from that. So the structure of Freud's theory is the same as the structure of these. A very important fact, because of course he's taking it from this culture. Okay, now we have quite an array of different understandings of the concept of freedom, but notice all of them have one thing in common. You can see it at the top left, and there it is, the concept of interference. Nobody has doubted that in some sense of interfere, freedom is about interference. Now notice the concept of interference turned out to be extremely complicated. Everything here is about interference. But so nobody doubts that that will do all the work. But at the end of the 19th century, people started in the Anglophone tradition to think, no, it doesn't do all the work. It doesn't do the work we need. This isn't the right way to think about freedom at all. And in the Anglophone tradition, it's the followers of Hegel who see that there's something missing here. And what they think is missing is that what you're looking at, they think, presents liberty as negative. Well, it does. It's an absence. The absence of freedom is always the presence of something else. What? Interference. So interference is the positive concept, freedom is the negative concept. Hegel wanted to say, and the Hegelians, of course, want to pick this up, that this is only the negative moment in a dialectic. And what we have to ask about a dialectic is, in this case, freedom, what is it for? This absence of interference. In order to do what? To understand freedom, you'd have to fill it out in that way. Now, freedom, of course, Hegel is unfair to the liberal tradition because the liberal tradition does fill it out. It says absence of interference in order to do whatever you want, within, as Mill says, the bounds of the harm principle, or as the earlier writers would say, as long as you act according to reason. But within those bounds, freedom is doing whatever you want. That's the positive idea. However, in the rise of Hegelianism in Anglophone philosophy, a very different answer was given, which also remains with us in political philosophy to this day. And according to this view of things, we want to be free not merely in order to be able to act at will, but in order to act, and here's the crucial claim, in such a way as to realize the essence of your nature. So here's a huge conceptual gulf, which separates this view of thinking about freedom from everything that you're looking at. Because it's saying, freedom is not a negative concept at all. For me to know whether you are a free person, I have to see how you behave. I have to see what you do. And I will be able to assess whether your actions are those of a truly free person, most fully realizing, as T.H. Green, a great exponent of this view, put it, most fully realizing what you have it in you to become. So there's the radical thought. Freedom turned out not to be about interference, it was about self-realization. Now you may not think that makes any sense, the essence of your nature. Notice that these writers help themselves to an enormously large premise, which is human nature is normative in itself. There are certain things which are distinctively human, other things are not human. What it is to be free is to be most fully human. We do talk like that. We say of something, you might say it's completely inhuman to do that. So we ought to think about this. We do think like this. But the question is, how can we fill this out? Well, back to Nietzsche for a moment. The Genealogy of Morality is an attempt to fill this out, and Nietzsche sees two answers, and one destroyed the other. The first was this. Here's the classical answer. This is Aristotle's answer. Man is the zoon politikon. The essence of your nature is to live in a polis, that's to say, to consecrate your time, your energies, and your virtues to acting for the common good. That will be yourself at its best. that will be truly you, and that is what it is to be a free person. Now, what interested Nietzsche was the destruction of that view by Christianity, which for Nietzsche, of course, was the morality of the slaves. The slave morality destroys it with this view. Your essence is not political, it is spiritual. And of course, Christianity has this anti-political element in it. Monasticism is a repudiation of the political, on one way of thinking about it. Now, that latter view is not a political view at all. It's the anti-politics that is embedded in Christianity. But if you turn back to possibility A, you have arrived at the heart of so-called positive views of freedom, and they are with us in contemporary political philosophy. The most celebrated exponent of exactly this view, of course, is Hannah Arendt, especially in her wonderful essay, What is Freedom? Her answer is, freedom is politics. Freedom is politics. That's to say, it's the arena in which your virtues, your powers are most fully expressed, so that you are most fully yourself in using these powers for the common good. And that is how to think of yourself as a truly free person. The other contemporary political philosopher, the most famous, who has adopted exactly this view, and I guess that Arendt and it's Charles Taylor I'm thinking about in his great book, Sources of the Self, have a common bond in Heidegger, coming from the Hegelian sources. But anyway, Charles Taylor in Sources of the Self makes this major distinction between what he calls concepts which are just opportunity concepts. They're about you having an opportunity to do something. And most people think of freedom as an opportunity concept because you're not interfered with, you have an opportunity. Taylor wants to say, like Arendt, freedom is an exercise concept. In order for me to know if you're free, I have to know how you are exercising your powers, not merely that you have opportunities. So that view has also come down to our own time. And once again, this is important. I mean, it's important not because I can think of further examples, because of Foucault's point that there's no such thing as a taxonomy which is exhaustive. This is not an exhaustive taxonomy, this is just how the concept has been thought. You may be able to imagine it thought in other ways, and I'm leaving that open for you to ruminate about. Okay, now I want to pause, although, as I understand it, I have got a quarter of an hour left. I hope that's true, because I want to say in these closing minutes that I don't think that anything that you're now looking at has come to what is fundamental about freedom. And that's why I'm standing here. I think that we're missing something absolutely fundamental about freedom in our general ways of thinking about it. And I want to have used this final quarter of an hour to talk to you about that. I can best start this final section of my talk by going back to Hobbes. Writers on Hobbes don't usually point out that when he laid out this view about freedom, which came so immensely influential, he had an enemy, and he was so successful in countering a rival view of freedom that it got obliterated largely. It got largely lost to sight. What I'm going to try to do is to bring it back to the surface. The view that Hobbes is trying to obliterate receives its most fundamental statement in what I've come to think is one of the founding texts for the whole of European political thinking, namely the Codex of Roman Law. The Digest of Roman Law begins by marking a basic and highly influential distinction between two types of person. The rubric is called De Personis. It has to do so because it's a code of law, and the question is who is subject to law. Now, only one of the two types of people singled out in the Codex is subject to law. And the distinction is the liber homo, meaning free man or woman, and the slave, the servus. The slave is not subject to law. Slaves, of course, are just property, so a slave has no legal obligations as well as no legal rights. Slaves are outside the law. There's no law of slavery. That would be a contradiction. So the law code has to focus on the question of what is it to be a liber homo, a free man or woman. Well, the answer is not to be a slave. Okay, obviously, because there are just two types of person. So to understand freedom on this account, what you have to understand is what makes a slave unfree. Once you know the answer to that, you'll understand freedom. Now, don't think that the answer is that the free person is not subject to coercion and the slave is. Because the free person, of course, is subject to coercion because laws operate by coercion. So that is not the distinction. It can't be. So it must be something other than interference. What makes a slave unfree, according to the Codex of Roman law, is simply the fact of having a master. Servus dominus. If that's the relationship, it's an unfree relationship. And of course, that goes into, profoundly goes into Western political thinking in the European tradition with the idea of the dominus. Could a king be a dominus, or is that tyranny? It's the fundamental question about freedom. It's the mere fact of having a master that makes you free. That's to say, freedom, what freedom is not being dependent on the arbitrary will of anyone else. So this tradition wants to say freedom is not basically about non-interference. It's not about self-realization. It's about whether or not you are dependent on the goodwill of someone else in any domain of your life. Now, the way this analysis works is as follows. You will not be a liber homo, you will be a slave, if there could be interference contrary to your interests. And if that possibility, notice it's not de facto, it's just a possibility, if that is due to your living in some domain of your life, for example in relation to paying taxes or something like that, do you depend upon the arbitrary will of some person who has no obligation to track your interests? Because if you do, then in that domain of your life, you are a slave. They don't, of course, literally mean you're a slave. They mean you're living like a slave. Now, notice a very important implication here. We're talking about possibility. Freedom is not de facto. So on this account, you can be unfree in the absence of any act of interference or even any threat of any act of interference. It's nothing to do with what's happening de facto. Freedom is a relationship. It's a relationship of a dominus to a servus. Are you, in any domain of your life, dependent on the goodwill of another who has no obligation to track your interests? Now, what will be said by a Hobbesian? Matthew Kramer, in his book, has a long attack on me for espousing this view. I quote Kramer saying, how can there be loss of freedom in the absence of any act of interference or any threat of it? What's been lost? There are two answers to that. One is the sort of metaphysical answer, which is that if any of your actions are done subject to the will of someone else, then you never act freely in that domain, because your action is always the product both of your will and of the silent permission of the person who could stop you, but in this case hasn't. So you're never an autonomous agent on this account, never. But secondly, and this is far more important to the politics of this view of freedom, once you become aware that in some domain of your life you are subject to the arbitrary will of somebody else, you will self-censor. You're bound to. And in classical antiquity, this is summarized in an unpleasant epigram of Tacitus: slaves are always slavish. Those in servitude are always servile. I mean, it's an etymological claim. Why are they servile? Because once you know that you're at the mercy of somebody else, in any domain of your life, you will do your best to commend yourself to them. You will do your best to keep out of trouble. there will be a complete existential inauthenticity. And that is unavoidable if you are in a condition of dependence. So there doesn't have to be any threat. No interference need take place, but you just know there are things you can't say, you can't do, you must say, you must do. Now, I've said that with the rise of liberal political philosophy to the ruling ideology, as it still is, the ruling ideology of our time, this became widely discredited as a way of thinking about freedom. But by no means wholly. There is a descent through early modern to modern political philosophy of people who want to think like this. There is the claim. The fact of independence takes away your freedom. There is the implication. Awareness makes you slavish. So here's the question. Who live as slaves? Here's the first answer. That's a good 17th century Polish answer. Monarchs have prerogatives. Prerogatives are discretionary. Discretionary powers are an instance of the arbitrary. To the extent that you live under a monarch who has any prerogative powers, so for example, extra parliamentary taxation, or allowing the nobles not to pay tax, anything that's arbitrary in the will of the monarch means that in that domain you are a slave. Now, that is the argument of the most famous English 17th century treatise on republicanism, James Harrington's Oceana. Here's a second answer that becomes extremely important in the 18th century with the rise of the European empires. This, of course, is already Machiavelli's view in the Discorsi. If you live as in a colony subject to an imperial power, then in certain domains of your life, you're going to live as a slave. This is the argument that the American colonists, the 13 American colonies of the British in America, used against the British in the Revolution of 1776. The predicament in which they found themselves was that they were subject to being taxed in the British Parliament, in which they had no representation. So the relationship of them to the British Parliament was arbitrary, in that the British Parliament could set taxation entirely as it willed and impose it without the consent of those who were subject to that taxation. The response of the British was to say, you can trust us. And the response of the Americans was to say, well, why should we trust you? As they said, if you can take one of our pennies, you can take all of them. Hence the Declaration of 1776. What did they call that? I don't think Americans even paused long enough at this point. They called it the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, from dependence, of course. Dependence upon the arbitrary power of the British Parliament to set rates of taxation without consent. Here's a further answer that became extremely important in the revolutionary decades of the 1790s, although this should have been seen far earlier. Mary Wollstonecraft, in her great treatise of Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, compares the position of English women to slaves in relation to their husbands. Husbands have rights of property over their wives. They're completely economically dependent upon them. So, of course, that might work perfectly well in that they might in fact share, but everything is subject to the goodwill of the husband. That means that, as she wonderfully puts it, women have to become the sort of people that men like. So there is the existential inauthenticity of the slave. And that book, of course, is full of metaphors of slavery. More strikingly, John Stuart Mill, who is usually presented as the liberal exponent of a theory of freedom, changes his mind, and in his last political work, 1869, called The Subjection of Women, he comes round to exactly this point of view and ends up by saying that he can see, I quote, no difference between the condition of women in our society now than that of bond slaves, because they have no power over their own property. Now, I want to end with this question. Are we happy in supposing that we've got beyond all this? I think that would be an extraordinary act of complacency. What about this? We live in deunionized economies. In some economies, like the one of my own country, or most dramatically of the United States, the economy runs to a considerable degree on illegal immigrant labor. There are no union rights, there are no rights whatever. I'm tempted to say that the relation of illegal immigrants in the labor force in a number of countries in Europe and all over America is subjection to arbitrary power. How can you negotiate wages in conditions in which you have no civil rights? Here's another worry. We now know that the state, certainly in my country, certainly in the United States, has taken, without our consent, the power upon itself to conduct extensive surveillance of all our activities with modern technologies. It's conceded that this infringes freedom, infringes privacy, which of course it does, if someone is, without my permission, following my movements, reading my emails. My point is that although, of course, questions of security are extraordinarily important, it's wrong to think of the issue as one of security versus privacy. It's one of security versus freedom. And that changes the terms of the debate if you value freedom. Because as soon as you learn that the state has taken these powers, you will self-censor. I know people who are very careful now about what emails they send. Now notice, that's not because they know what may happen to them. Nothing may happen. But because they don't know what may happen. And that's arbitrary power. Now, I've only got 1 minute left, but don't worry, I'm not going to overrun. I'm going to end here, but by telling you what I think is the point of these remarks, and there are 2 points I want to bring out. First, if you look at that, you'll see something absolutely fundamental in method in political philosophy, which is genealogy is always critique. What is it critique of? It's critique of the idea that we can do conceptual analysis in political philosophy. We usually can't. We're always being told in contemporary liberal political theory there's only one way of thinking about freedom, it's absence of interference. That's the only coherent way of thinking about it. So, for example, that's the foundation of John Rawls's great treatise on justice. Justice for Rawls is equal freedom. What is freedom? It's absence of interference. But there are other ways of thinking about it which are completely coherent. You may not think they're true, but look at them. We've got at least 3 rival traditions, all of which are part of a genealogical story. So there's a question mark in the case of such concepts about whether we can give conceptual analysis. What we certainly can't do is write narratives. You cannot turn what you're looking at into a narrative. It won't go. Because these people they're all in dialogue with each other. They all disagree. Final thought. You can't have all of these. You're going to have to choose. So which should you choose? Well, I don't think that it's the job of teachers in universities, especially in a very great university like this one, to have people come in and tell you what to believe. And I don't want to tell you what I think you should believe. Nietzsche says in the Genealogy of Morality, the best audience for philosophy is cows. Because cows know how to ruminate. They really ruminate. And that's what I think the job of the teacher is in political philosophy. It's to show you what there is to ruminate about. And as to the question, which of these views would you like to endorse, or maybe none of them, I want to leave it to you to ruminate. Thank you very much.
So my very question is related to that very important piece of your research on the very Republican conception of liberty. And you actually, in a way, resurrected that very concept.
That's the idea.
From the shadows of history of political thought. But my question would be partly methodological, related to what you said at the very end. What is, if there is any purpose of, in a way, finding different ways of thinking about the concepts that we use? What is the purpose of using or reusing political traditions that we have as regards our own concerns? Is there any relations, or does there need to be any link between our concerns now and the great concepts, great political ideas that we have?
Yeah.
Like, for example, the concept of Republican liberty. What is the purpose of our research then?
Yeah.
Can it help to understand better our problems today? So it's, I guess, quite a big question.
It's crucial.
Should I take some other questions?
I'd like to answer them as they come up, or else I'll forget. So I would really like to say something about that. Is that all right?
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think, insofar as the question is one about the relationship of our traditions to our current predicament, that it's very important that in European political speculation, largely through the influence of the legal tradition that we've all inherited, there are very strong continuities in the political concepts that we use. That being so, we need to clarify those concepts and see how they fit together. The way in which we've done that has generated a particular ideology which is hegemonal at the moment, which is some version of the liberal way of thinking about freedom. So, first of all, we need to clarify that. We need to have an inner understanding of it. It's about interference. What does that mean? It's about coercion. What does that mean? We can clarify all of this. You might find, and many people do, that that's the most useful concept to work with. But another way of thinking about our relationship to our traditions is that, of course, for I suppose, essentially Marxist reasons, we're all Marxists to this degree, the ideologies that we find ourselves left with are left through the pathway of history having been a certain pathway. That has meant that other ways of thinking get left on the wayside of history. They get abandoned. And a view like the Republican one, which thinks that justice is equal liberty, is an impossible thought to have in a neoliberal political landscape such as that of, for example, the United States. It just doesn't seem to resonate at all. It doesn't. But nevertheless, at a certain point in the history of our culture, that view was the hegemonal view. So we need to resurrect that and ask ourselves, is it a candidate for belief? There it is. And as you say, it's been pushed into the shadows for profound ideological reasons. Do we need to withdraw it from the shadows and ask about it again? So that's the kind of relationship of the historical tradition to our current problems that most interests me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please.
Then it's you.
Marta Galanka, I just want to clarify something. I'm not a political philosopher. However, exactly what you just said, just bringing this point, is this not a Marxist critique of economic liberalism in a way? I mean, I found listening to this that laissez-faire, let's say deregulation, creates the arbitrary power of the market. And therefore you have such as arbitrary power of the European Central Bank.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm hearing a very Marxist interpretation of what I was assuming would be more of an economic liberalism going towards Hayek or this sort of thing. Just please comment on that if you could.
No, I'm not a Marxist at all. I've written a great deal about why I'm not a Marxist. I'm a Nietzschean. I mean, there are profound reasons why this is not a Marxist analysis, because I would want to offer an account of all these as legitimating moves. But that is, on my analysis, not a Marxist way of thinking about legitimating moves, namely that they're ex post facto rationalizations and therefore don't enter into the causal explanation of the phenomena. For me, that fundamental assumption of Marxism, with a base superstructure way of thinking, is the mistake, because legitimation is a control on action. The requirement to legitimize is a directing force and therefore must enter the causal story. So the whole base superstructure way of thinking about ideology in relation to praxis is identifiably mistaken in my account. That's a kind of Weberian critique of Marxism, and that would be the position I'd want to take. I'm surprised you find anything Marxist here, because this is, as I say, this is a genealogy. And genealogy is a methodology to which Marxists are extremely hostile, because social determines consciousness. I mean, for me, there's no determination of consciousness here. We've got 3 different modalities of consciousness, and we need to think about them. Does that seem an answer to you? Yeah. There is a kind of technical but extraordinarily important point that's lurking behind this, which is the theory of ideology. And as I say, insofar as I am a theorist of ideology, I'm a very, to the extent to which questions about legitimation in the Weberian tradition seem to me what Marxism is really bad at understanding, and what has to be understood to be able to see where this sits. And where this sits is in relation to what different interpretations will legitimize and delegitimize. So the Republican analysis delegitimizes the neoliberal theory of the market, sure. The classical liberal analysis delegitimizes Marxist stories, so on. Yeah.
Zlata, please.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to question the Jeremy's Bentham idea of panopticon and the so-called ideal prison where all prisoners are feel this constant presence of government.
Yeah.
Today we are said to live in a surveillance society with the constant presence of CCTVs. So my question is as follows: would you say that this constant interference into individuals' freedom sparks people's desire to act in a low disobedient way? Thank you.
Say the last part of the sentence again. The interference.
Yeah, so basically today, as before, we are constantly being surveilled by government, and there's this perpetual interference into freedom,
yeah.
Individual's freedom. So would you say that this sparks even more desire to act in an undue manner, to
yes.
Act in a low disobedient manner? Thank
you.
No,
thank you. Very, very good question. You see, the difficulty, I can only really talk about the Anglophone countries, but the difficulty that a systematical surveillance state presents is that on the liberal understanding of freedom, it is simply not a problem, because there's no interference. And if you worry about the extent to which you're living under constant surveillance, it will not be because you're being interfered with, unless you think the surveillance itself is an act of interference. But it's not a coercive act, it's simply information being gathered. Then it will be because you think that you could be unfree in the absence of acts of interference. If you think that, you will take it very seriously. In the British Parliament, the current Prime Minister, in introducing the laws about surveillance, said, first of all, they're laws, and secondly, I quote him, as long as you've done nothing wrong, you've got nothing to fear. Okay, so first of all, who's defining what is wrong? And secondly, the way in which you might think that misses the point, is that there is unfreedom in the absence of any even threatened act of interference, because there will be self-censorship in the light of the knowledge. That's why some people take whistleblowing so seriously. You know a great deal of stuff which the state was not willing that you should understand or know about. And that affects your behavior. So it really, how much you worry about this depends on what view of freedom you take. On one view, it's not a particular problem. And in any case, we all think that security is important, and so there's a trade-off. And you might think, well, the trade-off is fine. If you think that freedom is absence of dependence on arbitrariness, the trade-off will look very different. You might still think the trade-off is the one to have, but that will be because you're trading your freedom. Yeah.
Rafał Lis, Jesuit University Ignatianum. Thank you, Professor, for your excellent and inspiring lecture. I would like to ask you two questions referring to the history of political thought. In the first place, how do you depict the role of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the history of liberty and republicanism, and consequently, how important to the picture is the problem of the legislative power? And the second question, how do you respond to the arguments put forward by David Wooten, encouraging us to differentiate between Respublika and a republic, attributing the latter simply to a popular government contrasted with monarchy per se? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, as I said at the outset, I placed an arbitrary limit on what I talked about to try and bring it under some kind of control, and so focused on the Anglophone tradition. If I had broadened my gaze to include the French Enlightenment, then Rousseau's attack on Hobbes, but also acceptance of Hobbes, would have been absolutely central, because Rousseau recycles the Machiavellian understanding of freedom that Hobbes sought to discredit. In fact, it's the great recycling of the Machiavellian belief that it is not possible to be a liber homo, a free man or woman, except if you live in a self-governing republic. Of course, it's exactly that view that Hobbes' view of freedom is attempting to set aside. The Contrat Social is the book that really re-enunciates what I'm calling neo-Roman or Republican way of thinking about freedom. So what matters for Rousseau is always dépendance, always his phrase. So liberté and dépendance are the two poles. So he is the example of this way of thinking. The point about Respublika and Republic, of course, if we're being literal about our translation, Respublika just means the res, the government, or whatever we translate res, the thing, the matter, is in the hands of the public. In the early modern period, they usually didn't talk about republics if they were talking in the vernacular, except in France, République. When the English had a republic, they didn't talk about it. They didn't call it a republic. They called it a free state, as Machiavelli did, civitas libera, as Cicero did, the vivere civile, vivere libero in the Machiavellian tradition. So why do they call it a free state? Why was Venice presented as the example of a free state? Because the claim is that it's only in a state in which you can recognize your will in the law through your having had instrumentality in the enactment of that law, that's to say through self-government, that you will not be dependent, because the law will either reflect your will as part of the general will, or it will reflect somebody else's will. If the latter, you are unfree, ex hypothesi. Only if the former are you free. So, you can be free, i.e. non-dependent, only if you live in that kind of a state, i.e. a vivere civile, a vivere libero, in which all law is made by the people. So that's why they call it a free state, and that's their preferred term, the vivere libero. Yeah.
Professor Kłoczowski.
You said that freedom is power and lack of interference, yes? But I want to...
I don't say that. I mean, a lot of people say that.
Yes, but I want to ask, in every society, every human has some rules and some commitments for their state. So, can we said that every person having totally lack of state, lack of interference of state? Thanks.
Yeah, very good. Okay, well, what I want to say is, of course, all states have laws, and all laws operate usually by means of coercive force, and usually in the form of a threat that disobedience will be punished. That's how law operates. It rarely operates any other way, except when it's an enabling force instead of a coercive force. So I completely agree that that is crucial. Now, the writers whom I'm interested in over here on the left-hand side of what you're looking at do not think that that is the fundamental question to ask about freedom. They want to ask a different question, which is, in relation to these laws that all states enact and which all citizens are required to obey, what is your relationship to the making of those laws? And what's fundamental to freedom is that you should be able to answer, I participate in the making of those laws, either by representation of my will or through my actual will. If you cannot say that that is your relationship to the law, then you are not free. So they want to distinguish between two kinds of states. Of course, in every state there is coercion, but they want to say it's not coercion that matters in the taking away of freedom. Coercion can give rise to freedom by stopping other people from placing you in conditions of dependence upon their will. The question is whether the state allows such dependencies. If it does, insofar as it does, it's not a free state, and you are not free. Insofar as it doesn't, it's a democracy. And this view is the view that you can be free only in a democracy. So it's anti-aristocratic, it's anti-monarchical, that's its history. Of course, above all, it's anti-monarchical. And that's why the term of republic comes to be so central, because a monarchy is not a republic and a republic is not a monarchy. But that's not the way they want to set it up. They want to say that monarchs enslave.
I'm slightly puzzled by your constant reference to Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, because after all it's a powerful critique of our modern democratic state, of homo democraticus, homo liber, all these ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, they precisely make us slaves. And Christianity, of course, is responsible for that.
Yes.
Christianity fostered democracy, and that's why democracy is bad. So, on the one hand, you seem to defend some sort of homo liber idea. On the other hand, you constantly refer to Nietzsche, who, after all, is a radical critique of everything you've said on the other hand, so can you somehow qualify your reference?
Good. I'll qualify it, if you like, by saying that my references to Nietzsche, there were only 3, in fact, were all methodological. What's important to me is a version of Nietzschean genealogy, not the full-blooded one that you rightly cite, in which the discovery of the origin of our beliefs discredits the belief. That's the fundamental claim he wants to get across in the genealogy. I haven't deployed that view. I've simply deployed a diluted Foucauldian way of thinking about genealogy of the kind that you're now looking at. So genealogy is important to me as a methodology in the same way, in part, that it was important to Nietzsche. That's to say, it criticizes your concepts. It asks you to alienate yourself from those concepts. The other way in which he's important to me is for the view about the history of concepts in relation to the understanding of concepts, and the wish to say that there's a body of concepts. He doesn't ever say what the boundaries of that are, but there's a body of concepts in relation to which there is only history. History is all there is. So I've accepted that view as well. What I have not accepted, I agree with you, is that writing the genealogy discredits the concepts. And that's quite right, so I should have been more precise about that. It is not, it seems to me, essential to genealogy that genealogy should be Nietzschean in that strict sense of supposing that once I understand the genealogy of morality, I will give up this idea of morality because I've seen it for what it is. I've seen it as a fraud. That's your Nietzsche. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Mine is a diluted Nietzsche.
You've mentioned Charles Taylor, who is seen as one of the most important communitarians. Mm. And I would like to ask you if you see the attempts of communitarians as a major proposal to reconceptualize, to rethink the concept of liberty itself. Thank you.
Yes. Well, I don't think Charles Taylor would nowadays want to label himself as a communitarian. It seems to me that in his late work, the 2 major treatises, Sources of the Self and The Secular Age, what he's been trying to revive is a Hegelian way of thinking about freedom. That is probably filtered through Heidegger. I don't know enough about his reading to know if that's true. Certainly Arendt has been very important to him. But the position is one that is not unlike what he laid out in his early major book on the one that's just called Hegel, in which he questioned the idea of freedom as being a negative concept, as opposed to the liberal understanding of freedom being an understanding of the negative moment in a dialectic. He wants to say the latter very strongly, that it's not an opportunity concept. So he has a normative view of human nature. He's of course a Christian, and that's very important to him. And the normativity is such that there is a certain way that you should be deploying your talents. And insofar as you exercise your freedom in that way, you are truly free. You're otherwise not. So I have him firmly over there. Do you, or do you want to put him somewhere else? I mean, I think he was a communitarian, but what he's been saying since the publication of Sources of the Self, which was what, in the mid-90s, is very much this story. Yeah, it's a major statement. Yeah.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, so let's have those and we'll see if there is the room for any more. Please.
Right at the back. Yeah.
If I understand correctly, Max Stirner, if I pronounce your surname correctly.
I'm sorry.
Shall I continue? Or?
Yes, no, start again.
Well, if I understand Stirner correctly, and if I pronounce his surname correctly, he sees everyone as and everything as potential property. On the other hand, we have Tishner, who says that if someone really values liberty, he shall not strive to take it from another human being. So is it possible for a free man to possess a slave, or is it nonsensical?
Yeah, very good. In the Roman law analysis that became so influential, it's absolutely not possible for a free man to be a slave, because the concept of slavery that they're talking about is someone who is dependent in all domains of their life upon the arbitrary will of another. So that is total lack of freedom. However, freedom, of course, is always on a spectrum. And they want to say two things, I think, about the free man and unfreedom. And one is paradoxical, that if you are a free man and you are imprisoned, you don't cease to be a free man. You cease to be free, but that's just because you've been locked up, and that's not what's fundamental about freedom. What's fundamental about freedom is the status of independence. So that makes an absolute distinction, but it also crosses the border in the liberal understanding of freedom by saying that it does not apply in cases where you might think it does. So all of that goes back to what makes the distinction for them an absolute one, which is that, here's the point, freedom is wrongly understood as being fundamentally a predicate of actions. Freedom is not fundamentally a predicate of actions, although you can be unfree because of someone acting coercively. Fundamentally, freedom is a relationship of wills. And it's a free relationship if the wills must track each other's interests, and it's arbitrary relationship if there's no obligation on one part to track the interests of another. So freedom is a will-will relationship, it's a status relationship. It's not about actions, fundamentally. So there's the real quarrel between the liberal and the republican. So the answer is, it's an absolute division for the republican.
Thank you. The libertarian economist Milton Friedman agree with the moral philosopher Immanuel Kant and John Locke on the subject of freedom. Milton and the other philosophers faulted the social security. They said it will be an infringement on individuals' rights when the government are forcing its citizens to save for old age. Here's my question. Would it not be in the interest of the society when citizens are forced to save for their old age?
Repeat the question. Just the question. What about Locke, I mean?
What I'm saying is that Milton and other philosophers faulted the social security. They said it will be an infringement on individuals' rights when government is forcing its citizens to save for their old age. Now, here is the question. Would any responsible government allow its aging population to live in poverty? Would it not be in the interest of the society when citizens are forced to save for their old age?
I'm having real difficulty. I think it's the microphoning. I'm having difficulty in hearing what you're saying. Come forward and say.
Okay.
Can you interpret?
Yeah, well, I can interpret only part of it. It's about the government's right to impose.
Yeah. Oh yes.
On us, but the last bit.
Yeah, the libertarian economist Milton Friedman agreed with the moral philosophers John Locke on freedom.
Yes.
Both Locke and Milton faulted the social security. They said it will be an infringement on citizen rights when the government is forcing its citizens to save for the old age.
Yes.
Now, this is a question.
Yeah.
Will it not be in the interest of the community and in the society when citizens are forced to save for their old age?
Yeah. Okay. So you want me to say more about Locke on freedom? Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's an extremely important point because I picked up just one aspect of what Locke was saying, which is what he's saying critically. If we are asking about the relationship of freedom to government in that theory, then the theory is a Republican one. The theory begins by attacking the idea of arbitrary power and vindicating the idea that law creates freedom. Law does not limit freedom. Of course, the law does limit freedom, but that isn't important in relation to what's fundamental about freedom. So the relationship of government to freedom for Locke is that it is the duty of government, on pain of loss of legitimacy, that it should establish equal freedom, where what that means is no one is dependent upon anyone else. That's what's laid out in the very first chapter. He then wants to say that, of course, in addition, coercion takes away freedom. And that's how I quoted him. But there he's engaging with the view that what freedom is absence of coercion. He doesn't believe that. His positive view of freedom is that freedom is absence of domination. So if there's a dominating power, you're unfree. So he doesn't completely present himself as a Republican because he's a monarchist and he thinks that freedom is possible under monarchy. I don't understand why he thinks that. But his view about the relationship of you to government and your freedom is that it must be non-arbitrary. The grounds for legitimate resistance to government as tyranny is the imposition of arbitrary power, so that there is a will within the state which is not obliged to track your interests. If that is true, you have a right of revolution. That's Locke's fundamental view. So, yeah, he's a Republican.
I have a question. On many occasions you have mentioned that every author takes part in the ideological battle of his times. And now, doesn't this apply to intellectual historians like yourself? I mean, you have mentioned that political philosopher is only to present the options and not to tell which one is right, which would somehow pose him outside the ideological battle. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I suppose I'm echoing Weber here again. It's not my business to tell you what to think, but certainly I think that the attempt to revive or restore, to bring back from the shadows a particular view of freedom which has been lost to sight largely through the triumph of neoliberal ideologies, is of course an ideological move. Absolutely. I don't make any strong distinction between political philosophy and political ideology. There's a continual tendency for the one to become the other, and it's unavoidable. The way to prevent us just finding that we're locked into ideologies is, in my view, of course, to expand our horizons by looking at traditions of thinking. Another way of expanding our horizons would be to be an extremely imaginative person, which is why I've put in other possibilities. I mean, these may not be in the tradition, they may not be in contemporary debate, but you may be able to think them out for us. That would be very important. In the absence of that level of imaginative grasp, the point is to place before us as full a range of coherent options for thinking about these concepts as can be. That enables you to see the extent to which they're ideological as well as philosophical. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm certainly not looking for converts. On the other hand, I think that something has been lost in current debates by not seeing that freedom might fundamentally be about something other than coercion. Yeah, I do believe that, yeah. But I'm not here to persuade you of that. I'm here to widen your horizons.
Okay, let us have the last question. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Michał Zabderiannos, Jagiellonian University. Thank you very much for this marvelous systematic taxonomy of types of liberty. And my question would concern classification of certain type of liberty, let's say. And I would draw this from Herbert L.A. Hart typology, let's say. He introduced this kind of a very subtle distinction between punishment, be a penalty, sanction, negative sanction, and between being judged, being condemned. Something different, something slightly different than it is. And my question would be, where would you classify this type of liberty of not being condemned? Would it be something like emotional thing, maybe something that being condemned impedes your self-realization?
Yeah, very good. So this is Hart's distinction that you're invoking. Yes, this is in Prolegomena to the Principles of Punishment. Yeah. Yes. Well, I really haven't thought about that. That's a very interesting point. Well, yeah, I see how it relates to different ways of thinking about freedom, because on one account, you could be condemned, and you could also be judged, and that might, in a certain sense, not affect your freedom. Whereas on another account, it would be the thing that affects your freedom. But I wonder if you have an answer to your own question. It would be distinct from that neo-Roman story.
The classical is not non-coercion, it would be about self-realization. Let's give an example, let's say, of homosexuals. It's quite of a relevant issue these days. There are political issues. A political issue is a recommendation that homosexuals should be judged also by others, also from the religious perspective.
Yeah, very good.
It impedes their self-realization. They feel oppressed by that. They're not strictly punished.
Yeah.
So it's something different, and maybe it's linked with the issue of panoptic society and being observed.
Yeah.
Being observed. So maybe it's because I would say honestly that your typology is excellent in arranging these types, but I see fields of overlapping.
Oh yes, of course.
So
yeah.
I guess that's not strictly one putting this concept, this issue in one place. It might overlap and it'd be cross-sectional, let's say.
Well, by the way, that's a very important point. I mean, these traditions are distinguished from one another insofar as is possible for clarity of exposition. But, of course, they bleed into each other continually in debate. And so that's a very important point to bring out. I mean, I'm profoundly of the view that there are three fundamental possibilities here, and that they're mutually exclusive. But you could rearrange the furniture quite a lot. Your example is an extremely helpful one, because there would be a very strong liberal objection in the example you take to the idea of judgment without penalty is what you're talking about, isn't it? To judgment, because that would come into the area, it would come central into the area that Tocqueville and Mill and subsequent liberals have been interested in, about the capacity of civil society to undermine freedom as well as to guarantee it. We think of civil society as a bulwark against the state, but we also in this tradition think of it as a potential enemy of freedom, because people will seek to evade the judgments. And the way to evade the judgment, as opposed to the penalty, of course, even if it's only a judgment, is inauthenticity. And because this is a theory of freedom, what is valorized above all is autonomy. And inauthenticity is one of the enemies of autonomy. So a million would answer you along those lines. And I would be very inclined to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this
thank you all
great
very much.
opportunity of hosting this wonderful lecture and discussion. And I hope this is not the last opportunity we're having.
Thank you.
So please be invited, feel invited to come again to our university and contribute to our academic life. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
It was wonderful to be here.
On behalf also of my students and colleagues.